March 15, 1940. London, England. A war-ravaged city shrouded in the heavy fog of imminent doom. The air, thick with the smell of burnt debris, carried the drone of aircraft overhead. The constant rumble of bombers could be heard in the distance. In the streets, people moved with hurried steps, eyes cast downward, minds preoccupied with survival. It was a city at war, on the edge of something far worse, teetering between survival and destruction. But beneath the chaos, hidden away in the dark, cluttered corridors of a small, unassuming workshop, one man was quietly working on an invention that could change everything. Tommy Flowers was an engineer, not the sort of man to command attention or make headlines. He wasn't a charismatic figure, nor did he possess the grandiose ideas that would later shape military history. He was an ordinary man, with a mind capable of extraordinary things. But in 1940, amidst the noise of war, the voices of men like him went unheard. Flowers had spent much of his adult life in relative obscurity, tinkering away in a world that seemed to have little use for his talents. He wasn't the kind of man to boast or seek glory. He didn't fit the mold of the war hero or the general whose decisions would shape the outcome of battles. And yet, it was this very ordinariness, this quiet stubbornness, that would bring him face to face with the greatest crisis of his life. Bletchley Park, a sprawling estate located just outside of London, was the heart of Britain's code-breaking efforts. It was here that the best and brightest minds in Britain gathered, deciphering the enemy's secrets to give their country a fighting chance. The work that took place within those walls was secretive, crucial, and dangerous. Yet, for all its brilliance, there was one crucial flaw. It was still a race against time. The Germans were ahead, and their secret weapon, the Enigma machine, was an almost insurmountable obstacle. Every day, the Germans changed the codes, making it increasingly difficult for the British to intercept and decipher their communications. But this was the point at which Flowers would enter the fray, though no one would know it at the time. Flowers wasn't part of Bletchley Park's elite group of cryptographers. He wasn't a part of the intellectual circles that dominated the war effort. He was just a humble engineer with a vision that no one else could see. And this was the first barrier he would have to break. The very idea that an engineer, not a mathematician, could solve one of the most complex problems in history. But Flowers, though deeply introverted, was determined. He had a solution. He believed that if he could build a machine powerful enough to crack the Enigma code, he could bring an end to the war. It wasn't a new idea. Many people had tried to crack the Enigma code before, but all of them relied on manual methods, long hours of decoding and deciphering, hoping for a breakthrough. Flowers, however, saw the problem differently. Instead of relying on human effort alone, he believed the solution lay in machines. Machines could do the work faster, more accurately, and without the fatigue that plagued human minds. But this idea wasn't one that the military or the top brass at Bletchley Park were ready to accept. At the time, Flowers was a part of the Post Office Research Station, a government-funded body that specialized in electronics and telecommunications. His background was in telephone exchanges, not military technology. His experience was with circuits and systems, not war. The military wasn't interested in his ideas. They had experts of their own, men with impressive credentials, and they saw no need for Flowers' unconventional approach. In fact, Flowers' idea was seen as a long shot at best and a waste of resources at worst. It's easy to understand why. The people at Bletchley Park were the cream of the crop when it came to intellectuals in cryptography and mathematics. Alan Turing, the genius who would later play a pivotal role in cracking Enigma, had already begun his own work on the machine that would bear his name. Flowers wasn't part of that world. He wasn't the kind of person who moved easily within academic circles or who could argue his case at the highest levels of power. He was a man who worked with his hands, with circuits and wires, not with theories and equations. But Flowers wasn't dissuaded. He knew, deep down, that his invention could make a difference. His vision of a machine that could decode Enigma messages faster than any human could ever hope to was, to him, the key to winning the war. The world might not understand his solution, but Flowers knew it was the only way forward. The only problem was convincing others. For months, Flowers was ignored. The military dismissed his ideas as impractical, too ambitious for their current needs. They didn't have the resources they claimed to fund such a complex and uncertain project. But Flowers refused to give up. He kept working, refining his design, building prototypes in secret, far from the eyes of the skeptics who couldn't see the potential of what he was trying to achieve. His machine, which would later become known as the Colossus, was designed to process the enormous volumes of encrypted messages that were coming in from German forces. The Enigma code was complex, and the task of cracking it required not only intelligence, but also immense computational power. Flowers knew that the human mind simply wasn't capable of handling the sheer volume of permutations required. But a machine? A machine could do it in seconds. The Colossus wasn't just any machine. It was a feat of engineering, built with intricate, hand-wired circuits and designed to read, decipher, and analyze the codes that had previously been thought unbreakable. Flowers spent long hours in his workshop constructing the first version of his machine. The design was primitive by today's standards, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Each wire, each connection, each component was meticulously placed, as if Flowers were weaving together the very fabric of a secret world that could change the course of history. But as much as Flowers believed in his machine, he knew that its true value wouldn't be realized unless it could be tested. So, he took the risk of showing it to his superiors at the post office. The reaction was predictable. They dismissed him, just as the military had done. The machine, they argued, was far too complicated, far too unreliable. It was just another pipe dream from an eccentric engineer. Yet, Flowers' determination did not falter. He was in a race against time, a race in which the stakes could not be higher. The fate of Britain, of Europe, and indeed the world, hung in the balance. But for all his brilliance, Flowers was still a lone voice, a man unheard, an innovator in a world that was far more interested in fighting battles than in building the tools to win them. As the war continued to ravage Europe, Flowers worked quietly, outside the limelight. He continued to refine his machine, making adjustments, improvements, and testing in secrecy. His progress, slow but steady, went unnoticed by those who should have been paying attention. Yet, for Flowers, there was no question of giving up. He couldn't afford to. The Colossus, in his eyes, was the key to victory. It was the solution no one else saw, and it would prove to be the weapon that changed the course of the war. But first, he had to make people listen. And so, he kept building, kept working, determined that one day, someone would understand the potential of his machine. In the silence of his workshop, Tommy Flowers fought not just for recognition, but for the future itself. He wasn't just an engineer. He was the quiet man with the impossible idea, the one who would be remembered not in the headlines, but in the code that would help bring an end to the war. And as March turned into April, and April into May, Flowers continued to toil, driven by the belief that somewhere, somehow, his creation would make its mark. The world was at war, and the only way to win was through the quiet brilliance of those like Tommy Flowers, the unsung innovators, the silent creators, the people history would forget, but whose work would change everything. July 23, 1940. A gray morning in London. The city was still recovering from the battering it had received during the Blitz. The world was teetering on the edge of an abyss. Yet there, tucked away in the hidden recesses of a nondescript government building, Tommy Flowers was about to embark on a journey that would shift the course of the war. His machine, the Colossus, was not ready, but it was getting closer. The war had taken an even darker turn since the German military had perfected the Enigma machine. A machine so complex that for all of Britain's efforts, their efforts to decipher the Nazi communications were still stumbling in the dark. Bletchley Park had become the heart of Britain's intelligence effort, a fortress of minds locked in a desperate race to crack the code. But Tommy Flowers, the overlooked engineer, had a secret weapon of his own. His Colossus was different. It was his belief that only a machine could handle the scale of Enigma, But it wasn't just about the power of computation. It was about seeing beyond the constraints of the intellectual circles that had already set the boundaries of what was possible. For months, Tommy worked in isolation, refining his design, tweaking the circuits, the intricate webs of wires that seemed to stretch infinitely through his cramped workshop. The constant hum of machines, the rhythmic sound of his hands at work, was the soundtrack to his every waking moment. There were no accolades, no cheers, just the quiet confidence that his invention, if completed, could change everything. But as his machine neared its final stages, there was one critical problem. Flower's creation had yet to gain the trust it needed from the very people whose approval could put it to work. He had tried again and again to gain the attention of those at Bletchley Park. But, again, he was ignored. They didn't have the time to entertain the notion of an engineer's machine, at least not until it proved itself. It wasn't that the work done at Bletchley Park was unimportant. Far from it. It was revolutionary in its own right. Alan Turing, the mathematician whose name would later become synonymous with the breaking of the Enigma code, was working tirelessly on his own machine, a device that would ultimately lay the foundation for modern computing. But Turing's machine was still in development, and Flowers knew it was only a matter of time before the scale of the work overwhelmed the cryptanalysts. They couldn't break Enigma by brute force alone, not without the computational power that Flowers' machine could bring. One fateful afternoon, the Colossus, its wires now neatly arranged, its circuits humming with an unfamiliar energy, was ready for its first test. Tommy knew the stakes. He knew that this was the moment that would define whether his ideas were just the fantasies of a man too far ahead of his time or the solution that could bring victory. It wasn't just about the machine itself. It was about breaking the cycle of failed expectations, about overcoming the military skepticism and the academic superiority of those who had disregarded him. And so, in the silence of the workshop, Tommy held his breath as the machine powered on. The first series of tests were promising, but not perfect. Flowers, who had designed the machine to handle complex encryption, found himself in a battle of patience and precision. Every moment spent troubleshooting felt like a lifetime, but with each adjustment, with every tweak to the machine's gears and circuits, the Colossus began to show signs of life. The gears turned, the tape spooled, and then a breakthrough. For the first time, the machine produced something meaningful, a readable output. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that Flower's machine wasn't just a dream. It was a reality that could take the war into a new phase. But even then, Tommy faced the most formidable obstacle of all, convincing Bletchley Park to take the machine seriously. When he finally managed to get the right people in the room, people who could see the potential of the Colossus, it was at best a reluctant acceptance. These were men who had spent months or years on methods that seemed to have little progress. The promise of a machine that could do the job in a fraction of the time, with the kind of speed no human mind could hope to match, seemed almost too good to be true. They were skeptical, cautious. Tommy wasn't some well-known scientist. He was just an engineer with an unconventional solution. How could they trust him when all the experts were still stumbling over the Enigma? But then something changed. The cryptographers at Bletchley, desperate to make any headway in their fight against the Enigma, agreed to give Tommy's machine a try. After all, they had nothing to lose. What Tommy didn't know was that his machine, the Colossus, would not only prove itself, but would quickly become the linchpin in the war effort. As Tommy worked side by side with the team at Bletchley Park, the machine began to crack codes that had previously been deemed unbreakable. Slowly, but surely, it began to reveal the enemy's most guarded secrets. Every day, Tommy watched as the machine ground away at the Enigma code. It wasn't fast at first, not by the standards that Tommy had hoped for. But with each new adjustment, each breakthrough, the machine gained speed. It was as if the Colossus had become a living entity, its intricate network of circuits and wires working in unison to perform the impossible. And then, one day, it happened. The machine cracked one of the most complex Enigma messages that had ever been intercepted. Tommy stood there, transfixed, as the code unfolded in front of him. The implications were immediate and enormous. This wasn't just a minor victory. This was the key to unlocking the entire German communication network. Yet, even with the machine's success, Tommy faced a bitter truth. He was still on the outside, looking in. The team at Bletchley Park, who had once doubted his creation, now acknowledged its power. But they weren't about to credit Tommy Flowers for the success. The man who had built the machine, who had given them the tool to win the war, was once again relegated to the background. The cryptographers and mathematicians who had rejected him were now the ones who would bask in the glory of this monumental success. The public, the press, the political leaders, they would all forget the man who had brought them the victory they now sought to claim. But Tommy, despite the growing frustration, understood the nature of the world he was in. It wasn't just about the machine anymore. It was about the people who held the keys to power. As the war raged on, Flowers found himself becoming more and more disillusioned. The Colossus had given Britain a fighting chance, but the recognition was never forthcoming. The military, the government, even his colleagues, none of them gave Tommy the credit he deserved. He had changed the course of history, but he did so in silence. The Colossus had cracked the Enigma code, but it did so behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the world. It was a war of secrets, and the cost of victory would be a history that would remember the men in suits, the mathematicians, the generals, but not the humble engineer who had built the machine that saved them all. It wasn't just that Flowers was denied the recognition he deserved. It was that, in many ways, the very nature of his work had been lost to time. The Colossus remained classified for years, its existence shrouded in mystery. Tommy's name became just another forgotten footnote in the story of the war. There were no parades for him, no medals. There was no acknowledgement of the immense contribution he had made. But even as he returned to relative obscurity, Flowers found solace in one thing. His machine had worked. The Colossus had done what it was designed to do. It had changed the course of the war and helped the Allies gain the upper hand. And, in the end, that was enough. The war was still being fought, still being won. But for Tommy Flowers, the victory was bittersweet. He had fought against the odds, against the world that refused to believe in him, and he had succeeded. But in the silence of his success, he would never truly know the extent of what he had accomplished. His story would not be told for decades. The Colossus would remain a secret, locked away in a vault of classified information. And Tommy Flowers, the man who had cracked the code, would remain just another forgotten genius in the shadows of history. But even as time moved on and the world changed, the impact of his work would endure. The Colossus had rewritten the rules of warfare, and in doing so, it had rewritten the future. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest triumphs are the ones that go unnoticed. August 14th, 1945. The war was over. The world that had been drenched in blood, fire, and smoke for years was beginning to stitch itself back together. The air was different now, still heavy, but tinged with the faintest scent of relief. Yet for all the celebrations that raged in the streets, for all the flags that fluttered and the cheers that rang out, there was one truth that few understood. Victory had come at a price, and the man who had helped secure it would remain forgotten. Tommy Flowers stood in the quiet of his small home, far removed from the bustling celebrations and speeches of a world that was moving on. His work was done, but his place in history had never materialized. His invention, the Colossus, had cracked the seemingly impenetrable Enigma code and turned the tide of war. Yet, to the world, Tommy was just another man, one whose name never quite made it into the history books, whose genius remained obscured by the dust of time.